That election, for those who don't know, was very, very tight. It was one of the closest in US history. Kennedy only won it because of 2 states, and the gap between Richard Nixon and JFK in those 2 states totals about 55,000 votes. And these were the 2 states of Illinois and Texas. Kennedy's running mate, LBJ, who obviously became the president after JFK in our time, in like the actual timeline, he was from the state of Texas, and he was very influential in that state. And then on top of that, you had Illinois, which is obviously Chicago, right? The Democratic Party in many like cities around the country were notorious for having what's known as machines, right? Very powerful, influential people, some of them political, some of them actually criminal, who would basically, at a time of elections, like they would really push for whatever candidate they wanted to be actually elected and stuff. It seems pretty obvious, yeah. And also as well, if you watch the film The Irishman, like kind of really, really good Scorsese film, it's out on Netflix, I believe, so definitely check that out. It seems that in the state of Illinois, there was about 8,000 or 9,000 votes, yeah. And even at the time, it seemed pretty clear that the election was stolen. However, when we compare 1960 to 2020, like if you look at my previous video, the video on what if there was a civil war in America, definitely check that out. And also note the like-dislike ratio. So at the moment, I think it's like 5 likes to 3 dislikes, and the comment section is quite lively. And it's because I try to take a very non-partisan view, kind of on the election. Just try to say like actually the process of electing the president is more important than who becomes the president, and that's obviously what the founding fathers like wanted when they set things up. That as George Washington said, a house divided cannot stand, and America has a very important role to play in the world, and the last thing that it needs is to tear itself apart over an election, because you want there to continually be elections. You don't want to crash the whole system because of one election. How did Richard Nixon, Tricky Dicky, as like that, future Watergate like guy, right? How did he respond? Like this is one of the most, like, he's notorious for even his own like senators and congressmen said that he's the most dishonest man that has ever that they've ever come across. How did he respond to this? I'm gonna read out his speech. I could think of no worse example for nations abroad who for the first time were trying to put free electoral procedures into effect than that of the United States wrangling over the results of our presidential election, and even suggesting that the presidency itself could be stolen by thievery at the ballot box. So even Tricky Dicky, even he was like, you know what, the eyes of the world are on America, and as much as I would like to be president, as much as my supporters would like me to be president, as much as it might be clear that this was a stolen election, actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's much more important that we keep the ball rolling, that we keep the system ticking over, because there's no sense in America crashing it itself. And that's why most people don't know about the 1960 US presidential election, because Nixon didn't make it a big thing. Even though you had many Republican congressmen and senators, notably Barry Goldwater, who later ran in the 1964 election against LBJ. Even though these people were saying it's a stolen election, we need to rerun it again, we need to and they contested it in all the different states and stuff. Nixon recognized that actually, in the context of America and the Cold War and America's obligation to its allies and to people around the world who look to America as a beacon for freedom and democracy, if you were distant in the Soviet Union, or like in one of the Warsaw Pact countries, behind the Iron Curtain, or if you were in China, if you were in any of these newly independent countries that Richard Nixon was talking about, who, upon becoming independent, they had 2 choices. They could either go to the Soviet Union, and communism, or they could go towards capitalism and democracy with the United States. And to have the United States in 1960 have torn itself apart because of just one election, that would have been really devastating for America's stand in the world and for the continued advancement and the prosperity of freedom around the world. Just wanted to make that point there. It's kind of, again, that shouldn't be a partisan point. I'm not going to say like who I kind of supported in the 2020 kind of election, but let's just say regardless of what side won, I am anti-mob. I'm pro law and order. I'm pro democratic procedures, and if the democratic procedures there are irregularities, you go through the legal procedures, you go through the courts, and if the courts rule it out, as much as you might not like it, that's it. You don't start a revolution, you don't start a civil war, you chill out and you go, right, next time we're going to fight this thing, we're going to fight it better. Something to note as well, this election was close, but it wasn't as, like, it was closer than it was expected, but it's a thing of, the 1961 was much closer than this one. If you were going to make an argument about voter fraud and stuff, yeah, and about swinging election, there's much stronger case for the 1960 election than there was in the 2020 election. So just saying that, hopefully the like-dislike ratio is probably going to go a bit off, but whatever. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I think that's something that people really need to scale back a bit and recognise. Before we go any further, that's something they just need to recognise. Now, how would this have affected how America conducts itself during the Cold War? So for a little bit of context, obviously America was fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union. It was capitalism versus communism. It was freedom and democracy versus totalitarianism. And so what things were happening in 1960, 1960, to, let's say, 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated, what things were happening in that world? You had the arms race, which, you know, the United States was way ahead. They had far more nuclear weapons than the Soviets did. However, this idea of there being a missile gap was something which had been played up by the Democrats, right? So before 1960, you'd had 8 years of the Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and you had Richard Nixon as his vice president. And in that time, they had focused on containment of communism around the world, so that new countries didn't become communist. You know, they weren't in favor of like all-out kind of wars as such. They were more in favor of like having a strong policy, but also like a very surgical kind of policy of like, let's get in and out and just deal with this little crisis, right? You know, as a result of that, you know, they built up the US military, they built up the nuclear arsenal, yeah? This idea of a missile gap, yeah, in terms of the Soviets being able to close this missile gap, it was largely a myth which JFK and others in the Democrats really tried to play up. The idea was that if they could make people be scared of this thing of like, oh, the Soviets are catching up, they're going to overtake us, yeah? It would make the Republican administration look weaker, and that they'd drop the ball, and therefore the Democrats could come in. So JFK, throughout the thing, routinely was going on about this missile gap. And as soon as he got into office, he was like, oh yeah, clearly there isn't actually this missile gap. So yeah. Anyway, there were many other things that were happening in the late 50s, early 60s, which impacted America. So we're going to get into that in the course of this video. First things first, we need to look at what happened in Cuba. So 1959, you had the Batista regime, which was supported by the United States, and it was overthrown in a revolution by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and like kind of, you know, like there were suspicions at that time as to whether Cuba was going to go communist or not, because the Eisenhower administration recognized that while Castro at that point hadn't come out as a communist, there were many people in his like little like band and stuff, yeah, who were out and out communists, and so he had a lot of suspicions about this, yeah? And then the fact that Castro later came in and like nationalized all the predominantly American-owned industries, that really started to like get on the administration's nerves, and it started having closer and closer ties to the Soviet Union. As a result of this, there was a plan put together by the CIA. The Bay of Pigs had been something that had been set up by the CIA, where you had a group of, I believe, 15,000 Cuban exiles who had fled to like Miami after the fall of the Batista regime. And the idea was that they would land on the south side of Cuba, a few miles away from Havana, and they would overthrow when they landed, the people would rise up against like Castro and like his communist like kind of like people, but there would basically be a counter-revolution as such. And the reason why this didn't work is because no one had briefed Kennedy on this when he became president, and so the plans had already been put in place, and so when he just kind of was like, well, okay, it can go ahead, but we're not going to send in the US Air Force to back it up. And as a result, these Cuban exiles were stuck on the beach, and they were bombed to bits, and many of them were captured, and it was a huge humiliation. And the Kennedy administration didn't understand at the time the consequences of this being a failure. They didn't understand the consequences of the Air Force not being there and supporting them, and how it would make their administration look weak against communism. What we have to ask ourselves is, if Kennedy hadn't become the president and Nixon had become the president, what would Richard Nixon have done? What I was watching just before making this video, yeah, because I've seen it many years ago, yeah, but I had to just watch it again just as a kind of like as just a comparison. So we've all seen the the debates that took place in 2016, in 2020, and all the kind of recent years, go on YouTube now, or after you've watched this video, of course. There'll be a link in the bio here, like kind of if I remember correctly. But check out the debates between Richard Nixon and JFK. Watch how civil the thing is. Watch how both men kind of go, they respectfully disagree with the other. Look about how what they're debating about is actually about the issues at hand. It's not talking about you are this and you're that and he's, it's not about that. It's focusing on the issues that the American people actually care about. It's very civil. It's very civilized. This is what statesmen look like, yeah. And I don't think on either side of the 2020 election you've seen that. I don't think on any side of the 2016 elections you saw this. Many elections you've seen people, as it were, play the man and not the ball. When we really contrast this, we have to recognise that Nixon, he wanted policies which, he basically wanted to continue the Eisenhower administration's policies. He wanted continued prosperity. The Eisenhower administration, it was one in which the American dream really took off. It was a time where economic growth was huge. Wages for ordinary people grew and grew. The gap between rich and poor continued to go down. Things were getting better for the average American. You had civil rights legislation being passed. The whole country was moving steadily but surely in the right direction. In a positive kind of direction. More and more people were being supported. You had many poor people in America, and the poverty rate continued to decline as more people got more affluent middle class jobs and moved out to the suburbs. A lot of things were happening in the 50s that were really good. And we look back at the 50s as a time when America was, when we think about American culture, we tend to think back very nostalgically to the 50s. The 1960s could have very much been an extension of that, but if you'd had the Republicans in, you might not have necessarily had the huge divisions that we had. The Democratic Party was very divided on issues to do with Vietnam and on issues to do with race and on several other issues, but these are the two kind of main defining ones that happened in the 60s. So on civil rights, you had Northern Democrats, who tended to be a lot more liberal and much more in favour of civil rights legislation, and then you had the Dixiecrats, who were Southern Democrats, who were very conservative and were opposed to civil rights legislation. So the Democratic Party was divided on that issue. And oftentimes a lot of the legislation, if you look at the legislation that was passed, whether it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many other things, the Republican Party tended to be more on the side of civil rights than the Democratic Party. And this contrasts really greatly with what we see in the present day. So in the present day, the parties themselves tend to be drawn along ideological lines, where you have all the Republicans voting one way and you have all the Democrats voting another way, and therefore it really matters which party wins that election. Whereas in those days, the norm for most of American history has been a thing where the party system has been relatively weak. So actually there were quite a lot of kind of cross-party collaborations that people had, and most of the legislation that was passed in those times, although you had a Democrat majority in the House and Senate, in particular in the House, it still didn't mean that legislation couldn't get through. It still didn't mean that people couldn't pass things, because the Republicans would work with the Democrats and the Democrats work with the Republicans. It was much more based on the individual statesmen, and how they decided to vote on an issue, rather than it being one camp versus another. So while the Democrats were split on the issue of, for instance, civil rights, the Republicans were relatively unified. However, the Democrats, who were pro-civil rights, were more fervently for civil rights. They wanted it much quicker, and they wanted the federal government to play a much more active role in that. The Republicans, by contrast, were opposed to Jim Crow. They were opposed to the racial segregation. They wanted desegregation in school. They wanted desegregation in the schools. They wanted desegregation across the board, but they wanted it to be done on a state-by-state basis. This is where kind of the issue of states' rights starts to really kind of become an issue again in America, because the pro-civil rights Democrats in the North are not interested in the states' rights. They want the federal government to come in and say, no, actually, we're passing passing this legislation at a federal level that prohibits segregation and forces like integration and forces like, you know, you had busing. So really trying to like really stamp out like racism in that sense. But they were opposed by Democrats in the South who like would filibuster, who would stonewall, who would really do everything that they can to make sure that that legislation didn't pass. If you'd had a Republican presidency throughout like the early 60s, you might have seen perhaps a slower civil rights thing, a more muted civil rights movement, but it would have been a much less contentious one because it would have been a thing where Richard Nixon focused a lot more on the states, on going through the states and on getting like the states to approve it and stuff, rather than it being the federal government kind of imposing like on it. So whether that's right or wrong, that's just like the situation. That's what they wanted.